If you've been following Apple for a while or know the company's history, you'll probably remember them having quite a few rivals over the past 35 years. In the 80s, it was IBM, in the 90s, it was Microsoft, and in the 2000s, it eventually became Google. But the rivalry between Apple and Samsung is more recent and more unique, since Samsung not only competes with Apple in the notebook, tablet, and smartphone markets, but also supplies Apple with key components for their devices, like the iPhone's OLED display and flash memory chip. So let's explore how the two companies' relationship soured and how they feel about each other today. This is Greg with Apple Explained, and if you want to help decide which video topic I cover, make sure you're subscribed, and these voting polls will show up in your mobile activity feed. And don't forget to check out our new iGenius plush doll at appleexplained.com. Now, many of us today have become familiar with Samsung through the consumer electronics they sell, but those business endeavors are actually a fairly recent development considering the company's long history. In the 80s, Samsung's electronics division was focused primarily on the semiconductor business, and their then CEO, Lee Byung-chul, spoke with Steve Jobs on several occasions for advice or negotiations. In fact, the two met in person in 1983 at Samsung's offices in Seoul. Around that time, the company decided to make a sizable investment in a new chip plant in China. It's unknown if Jobs encouraged Samsung to expand their semiconductor business, but the two CEOs clearly had a friendly relationship. Apple went on to become Samsung's biggest client, ordering billions of dollars worth of electronic parts. But the friendly and cooperative relationship between Apple and Samsung didn't last forever. Before the original iPhone was announced, then Samsung CEO Lee Jae-yong visited Apple's headquarters to meet Jobs. It was then when Jobs revealed the device to Jae-yong and disassembled it, explaining how the iPhone's technology worked. And as you might expect, Samsung took the idea and ran, releasing their own touchscreen smartphone called the Galaxy just 2 years later, which ran on Google's Android operating system. As a result, Jobs asserted that Android was a stolen product and eventually called Samsung a copycat. It was at this moment when Samsung went from being Apple's ally to Apple's enemy, and the lengthy legal battle that began between the two companies in 2011 was proof that Apple was prepared to protect its intellectual property at any cost. The 7-year lawsuit war started with Apple striking first in 2011, but it wasn't something that came out of the blue. In fact, Apple approached Samsung in 2010 and told them up front that their smartphones and tablets were infringing on Apple's patents. And because the two companies had a long history of cooperation, Apple was willing to work out a deal. They proposed a licensing agreement where Samsung would pay Apple up to $30 for every phone sold and up to $40 for every tablet. But the company declined, since they didn't believe their products had infringed on any of Apple's patents. So the following year, Apple issued the lawsuit, claiming, instead of pursuing independent product development, Samsung has chosen to slavishly copy Apple's innovative technology, distinct user interfaces, and elegant and distinctive product and packaging design in violation of Apple's valuable property rights. So was this true? Did Samsung really rip off the iPhone and steal features that Apple had patented? Well, let's see how Samsung smartphones looked before the iPhone and after the iPhone. So I think it's pretty obvious that Samsung borrowed heavily from innovations the iPhone pioneered. But what exactly were the offenses? After all, in a lawsuit, a company has to point out specific violations of their patents in order to successfully make their case. Well, Apple made a total of 16 claims against Samsung, but I want to focus on 3 in particular: trade dress infringement, trademark infringement, and infringement of design patents. Let's start with the first one, trade dress infringement. Now, what does that even mean? Well, a trade dress is the visual appearance of a product or its packaging that represents its source. In other words, it prevents companies from imitating other products in the marketplace as to prevent confusion among consumers, who may believe they're buying a product from a certain brand when in reality it's just a knockoff. And that's why we see so many knockoff Apple products sold in China, but rarely in America, because our trade dress laws protect companies from imitators. In fact, the very first iMac was imitated by an American company called eMachines with a product called the E1. It was clearly a knockoff of the wildly popular iMac, but it didn't do too well since Apple successfully sued the company through a trade dress claim. Now, clearly Apple felt Samsung was doing the same thing by ripping off the iPhone and iPad's trade dress for their various devices, and as you can see from this picture, there are quite a few striking similarities that aren't likely due to sheer coincidence. Next is trademark infringement, and this is where things get a little obvious, because while Samsung may have been able to argue that the similarity in hardware design was incidental, the similarities in software elements like the icons became much more difficult to defend. There are literally hundreds of ways to design any given icon, and in many cases, Samsung just so happened to choose the same visuals as Apple. And third was infringement of design patents. These included the home screen icon layout, the form factor of the iPhone's chassis, and the screen and button designs. So if we add all of that up, we have claims ranging from branding to software design to hardware design. Essentially, every major component of these select Samsung devices Apple claimed were copied from their iPhone. And what did the court think of all this? Well, they ruled in Apple's favor. They ordered Samsung to compensate Apple $1 billion for their infringements and to never do it again in the future. But this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, the two companies were just getting warmed up. Samsung ended up appealing the verdict and countersued, claiming some of Apple's products were infringing on their patents. This legal back and forth continued for years, with both sides enjoying some wins and suffering some losses. Apple managed to ban Samsung's Galaxy Tab from Germany, which forced the company to redesign the device, but Apple was also found guilty of infringing on Samsung's cellular data patent with the AT&T iPhone 4, 3GS, and 3G, as well as models of the original iPad and iPad with 3G data radios, which meant Apple would be banned from selling AT&T models of some iPhones and iPads in the US. But the White House had a chance to veto the decision, which is exactly what President Obama did. Now, the 7-year-long lawsuit war came to an end in June 2008 when Apple and Samsung agreed on an undisclosed settlement. Although it's unknown what that settlement was, it's worth considering how much damage the entire ordeal had on both companies and how little each were compensated in return. But clearly Apple saw the legal battle as a victory when they released this statement. We believe deeply in the value of design, and our teams work tirelessly to create innovative products that delight our customers. This case has always been about more than money. Apple ignited the smartphone revolution with the iPhone, and it is a fact that Apple blatantly copied our design. It is important that we continue to protect the hard work and innovation of so many people at Apple. We're grateful for the jury for their service, and pleased they agree that Samsung should pay for copying our products. Samsung declined to comment. Now, you'd probably imagine that after all those lawsuits, Apple and Samsung would want nothing to do with each other, but it turned out to be quite the opposite. Because Samsung still provides Apple with crucial components for their most popular products, the iPhone X's beautiful OLED display was brought to you by Samsung, as well as its memory chip. And the revenue generated by these component sales are staggering. Samsung earned $110 for each iPhone X sold, and since Apple sold an estimated 130 million units, that adds up to over $14 billion for Samsung. Compare that to the component revenue of their own Galaxy S8 at $10 billion, and you begin to understand how symbiotic the relationship is between the two companies. Apple relies on Samsung to provide high-quality components that can be mass-produced at scale, while Samsung relies on Apple to buy the components they make. So the destruction of either company would be detrimental to the other. And I think that's why Tim Cook dialed back on the aggressive stance Steve Jobs took on the Android and Samsung case back in 2010. Jobs said, "I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go thermonuclear war on this." And although he was referring to Android in that specific quote, those feelings extended to other companies like Samsung, who he thought were also copying Apple's products. But in 2012, Tim Cook made it clear that he preferred a different approach. He said, "I'd highly prefer to settle versus battle. But you know the key thing that's very important is that Apple doesn't become the developer to the world. I've always hated litigation. We need people to invent their own stuff." So although Cook wasn't interested in dragging out Apple's legal disputes against Samsung, he was interested in relying on Samsung less for components, because in 2018, Apple reportedly added LG as a supplier of OLED displays, who began test runs of mass-produced panels near the end of 2018, and many believe Apple will begin using LG panels in the new iPhones released later this year. This will not only improve supply chain reliability, but also give Apple negotiating power with both suppliers, hopefully resulting in less expensive panels. But that isn't to say Apple and Samsung are growing apart, because just a couple months ago, the companies announced a deal that took many tech fans by surprise, and it was that Apple would bring iTunes movies and TV shows to Samsung smart TVs in addition to AirPlay 2 support. Which means not only will users be able to access their existing iTunes library and buy or rent movies and TV shows from the iTunes store, but they'll also be able to play videos, photos, music, podcasts, and more from Apple devices directly to Samsung smart TVs, something that was previously only possible with the Apple TV set-top box. And this is another great example of Apple and Samsung working together in a way that benefits both companies. Samsung will likely sell more TVs since they'll have iTunes and AirPlay, and Apple will likely sell more movies and TV shows since there'll be more people shopping on the iTunes store. So we've recognized that Apple's relationship with Samsung has had its ups and downs, and it's true that they're direct competitors in a number of markets, but moving forward, I think we'll see more cooperation between these two companies rather than conflict, mainly because they've both been challenged by a new rival, Huawei. They're a Chinese-based consumer electronics company that has been exploding in popularity thanks to their inexpensive, high-quality smartphones. Apple and Samsung both made a concerted effort to expand their presence in China to take advantage of their larger consumer market and growing economy, but things didn't go as planned for either company, since Chinese manufacturers like Huawei disrupted the market by undercutting the iPhone and Galaxy while still offering full-featured premium phones. In fact, in the last quarter of 2018, Apple's worldwide smartphone market share dropped 2 percentage points, and Samsung's dropped 1 percentage point, all while Huawei managed to grow their hold on the smartphone market by 4 percentage points, which means they're one of the only companies not experiencing slowing smartphone sales. So it seems as if Apple and Samsung have more or less become natural allies in the last couple years. They ended the lawsuit war, they're striking deals to help each other access more paying customers, and they still cooperate on component manufacturing. But only time will tell if this trend toward friendliness will continue, or if a new disagreement will cause a divide between the two companies yet again. Now, if you want early access to my next video, be sure to join our Patreon community, and don't forget about our affordable new iGenius plush doll available at appleexplained.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.